Bikers threaten Sylvester Stallone, unaware he has a black belt in karate. Before we dive in, kindly hit the subscribe button, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Stallone had always been someone who cherished the open road, the quiet hum of tires on asphalt, the endless horizon, and the feeling that there was nowhere to be, no one to meet, just the road and him. He didn't need company, and certainly didn't need anyone telling him where to go. The world had become increasingly chaotic, but out here, in the vastness of the desert, he could breathe. He could think. That's why, when the opportunity arose to take a solo trip through the Grand Canyon, he didn't hesitate. A rented Jeep, a full tank of gas, and the promise of days alone in the wilderness was everything he needed. The stress of city life, work, expectations, people, had piled up, and he was ready to leave it all behind, even if only for a few days. The drive from Flagstaff was quiet, the road winding through the desert, and gradually into the mountainous terrain that would lead him to the canyon's edge. Stallone found himself lost in the landscape, watching as the world around him shifted in dramatic layers of color. Red rocks, brown earth, and the occasional flash of green from a cactus or scrub bush dotted the horizon. He loved the way the light shifted during sunset, turning the canyon into a jagged silhouette against an orange-pink sky. He reached a small overlook on the side of the road, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the canyon in hues of gold and amber. He parked the Jeep, letting the engine idle as he took in the view. The vastness of the canyon stretched out before him like an ancient sea of rock, its depths so profound that they seemed to swallow the very light of day. The world was so large, and he felt so small in comparison. It was humbling. Stallone stepped out of the Jeep, his boots crunching against the gravel as he took a deep breath of the cool desert air. The emptiness was perfect. No noise, no distractions. It felt like he could stay here forever, away from everything, away from the noise of civilization. But that peace was short-lived. The rumble of motorcycle engines broke the silence, and Stallone turned to see a group of bikers coming down the road toward him. They were a sight to behold, large, muscular men clad in black leather jackets, the smell of gasoline and engine oil hanging in the air as they pulled up to the overlook. Their bikes roared to a halt, their chrome glinting in the fading sunlight. They dismounted with an air of entitlement, like they owned the place. Stallone didn't immediately think much of it. People passed through here all the time. Maybe they were just out for a ride like him, looking for some quiet. But there was something about the way they moved that made him uneasy. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and a patch over his eye, stepped forward first. His eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Stallone. "Nice view, huh?" the leader said, his voice rough as gravel. Stallone nodded, his arms folding across his chest. "Can't beat it." The leader studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge him, and then let out a chuckle. "You must be new around here. We don't get many solo types in these parts, especially not in a rented Jeep." Stallone didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let his gaze shift from the leader to the other bikers, noting their tense, predatory stance. Something didn't feel right. These weren't just casual travelers. There was a reason they'd stopped here, and it wasn't to admire the view. The leader's gaze flicked toward the cabin behind him. It was a small, rustic structure, nothing fancy, just a quiet spot that Stallone had reserved for the weekend. He'd been looking forward to the peace it offered, away from the noise of the world. "You see that cabin back there?" the leader asked, jerking his head toward the small building. "It's ours now. You're gonna need to leave." Stallone's heart rate barely increased, but his body tensed. It was a strange thing to say, almost as though the man expected him to just roll over and hand it over. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Stallone said calmly. He wasn't one to back down, especially when it came to what was his. "I've got a reservation. That cabin is mine." The leader scoffed, and the other bikers chuckled. "Reservations don't mean much out here," he said. "In fact, I think it's time for you to hit the road, unless you want things to get unpleasant." Stallone's eyes narrowed. It was clear now that these men weren't simply offering him a friendly suggestion. They were trying to intimidate him. He had seen men like this before. Bullies who thought they could push others around just because they had the numbers or the muscles. But Stallone wasn't just going to back down because of a few tough guys on motorcycles. "Listen," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not looking for trouble. But if you think you're taking my cabin from me, you're going to be sorely disappointed." The leader smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. "You don't know who you're messing with, buddy. We're not just going to let you waltz away with that cabin. Not without a little persuasion." As the gang began to circle him, Stallone stood his ground. His heart rate didn't spike, his breathing didn't quicken. His mind was calm, focused. He wasn't about to be pushed around by a bunch of bikers, no matter how tough they looked. The desert wind kicked up around him, carrying with it the distant sound of engines revving. But all Stallone could focus on was the leader in front of him. "You'll regret this," the leader said, his voice dripping with menace. But Stallone only raised an eyebrow, his muscles relaxing as he prepared for what was coming next. He wasn't afraid, and he wasn't backing down. If they wanted trouble, they were about to find it. Without another word, the leader lunged toward him, the first strike coming faster than Stallone anticipated. But he was ready. Stallone's eyes flicked briefly toward the horizon, where the last remnants of daylight were slipping behind the canyon walls. He was aware of the sounds, the idle revving of engines, the shifting weight of the bikers as they closed in. It was the kind of tension that built up slowly, like the tightening of a noose, and Stallone knew they were about to make their move. The leader of the gang, his boots crunching against the dirt as he stepped forward, was the first to make a move. "You've got a lot of nerve standing here like you own the place," the man sneered, his voice rough and thick with disdain. "I think it's time to educate you on how things work around here." Stallone stood still, his expression unreadable. He was no stranger to confrontation. He had been in enough tight spots to know when to fight and when to let things slide. But there was something in the leader's tone, in the way the bikers were circling like wolves, that told him this wasn't just about the cabin. This was about pride. The bikers had been out here for far too long without anyone challenging their territory, and they weren't going to let some lone traveler come in and make them look weak. With a sudden, sharp motion, the leader lunged forward, a fist aimed directly at Stallone's face. But Stallone was already moving. He slipped to the side with fluid ease, his body a coiled spring of controlled energy. The punch missed by inches, and without hesitation, he grabbed the leader's wrist mid-swing. With one sharp twist, Stallone forced the man's arm behind his back, driving his knee into the leader's spine with a force that made the man gasp for air. "Let's slow this down," Stallone said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't want any trouble. But I'm not backing down." The gang members froze for a split second, their faces reflecting confusion and anger. It wasn't supposed to be like this. They'd thought they'd scare him, intimidate him with their numbers and their rough exterior. They weren't expecting someone who could move like Stallone, who had enough experience to know how to handle himself in a brawl without losing his composure. The leader grunted and struggled against Stallone's grip, but Stallone tightened his hold, pushing the man's arm higher up his back. "I told you," Stallone said through gritted teeth. "I'm not here to fight. But I'm not leaving. This is my cabin. You want to try and take it from me? Fine, but it's not going to be as easy as you think." The rest of the gang watched, their eyes flicking nervously from the leader to the man who had them all momentarily at a standstill. They had underestimated him. They thought they could bully him, force him into submission, but now they saw something entirely different. A man who wasn't afraid, who wasn't intimidated by the mere size or strength of their group. "Get him off me," the leader spat, his voice thick with anger and disbelief. But Stallone wasn't fazed. He took a deep breath, his body fully centered, before pushing the leader away with a force that sent the man stumbling backward into the dirt. Without missing a beat, the other bikers began to advance. Two of them flanked him, one on each side, while another circled behind, likely to grab him from behind and catch him off guard. But Stallone wasn't concerned. He could hear the movement, the shuffle of boots against gravel, the slight shifts in their weight. It was like a dance to him, a pattern he had seen hundreds of times before. The first biker lunged for him with a wild punch, but Stallone ducked low, his body dipping like a fluid shadow. He grabbed the man's outstretched arm, twisting it around his back in a quick, efficient move. The biker let out a sharp yelp of pain, and before he could react, Stallone drove his elbow into the man's ribs with enough force to knock the wind out of him. The biker crumpled to the ground in a heap. A second biker, bigger and more muscular than the first, swung a heavy fist at Stallone's head, hoping to land a knockout blow. But Stallone's reaction was instantaneous. He ducked and weaved, his movements swift and precise. As the man's fist passed over his shoulder, Stallone planted his feet and launched himself forward, delivering a brutal side kick to the man's midsection. The biker flew backward, hitting the dirt with a thud. Stallone's focus remained razor-sharp. He could hear the footsteps of the third biker behind him, moving quickly to close the distance. The gang leader was still struggling to get up, his face contorted in pain and rage. But Stallone wasn't giving anyone a chance to regroup. He spun on his heel, catching the third biker in his peripheral vision. The biker swung a crowbar, aiming for Stallone's head, but the weapon never made contact. Stallone's reflexes were a blur. He ducked under the swing, then slid behind the man with lightning speed. With a quick jab to the back of the biker's knee, the man dropped to the ground with a grunt. Stallone followed up with a knee to the face that left the biker dazed, sprawled across the dirt. The leader, now back on his feet, glared at Stallone with pure fury. "You're going to regret this," he hissed, his hand reaching for a knife strapped to his belt. But Stallone wasn't fazed. He had seen all kinds of men try to use intimidation in these situations. The bikers had been rough and loud, but they weren't prepared for the calm precision of someone who had seen more than his fair share of street fights, gym brawls, and everything in between. "You're outnumbered," the leader growled, pulling the knife free. His voice was laced with venom, but Stallone's response was steady. "I don't need numbers. I've got skills," he said, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the leader. The gang leader, furious and now wielding a knife, took a step forward, his body tense as he prepared to strike. Stallone's body was still, every muscle ready. "Come at me then," Stallone said evenly, a subtle smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But I'll warn you, it's not going to be as easy as you think." The leader lunged, the blade flashing in the moonlight, but Stallone was already in motion. He sidestepped and grabbed the leader's wrist in midair, twisting it with a brutal, controlled force. The knife clattered to the ground, but the leader didn't have time to react before Stallone sent a precise, powerful punch straight into his solar plexus. The leader gasped, his body folding in on itself from the impact. He crumbled to the ground, unable to catch his breath, the fight knocked out of him. For a moment, there was only silence. The remaining bikers, now bruised and battered, stood motionless, watching as their leader lay on the ground, gasping for air. Stallone took a step back, his breathing steady and controlled, his eyes flicking over the men who had once thought they could intimidate him. He wasn't interested in finishing them off or making this a bloodbath. He had made his point. "Leave," he said, his voice calm but resolute, "before I make things worse for you." The bikers exchanged hesitant looks, their bravado beginning to fade as they realized the truth of Stallone's words. They had come to steal, to take what wasn't theirs, but now they found themselves defeated, standing before a man who wasn't afraid to stand his ground. One by one, the remaining bikers turned and mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life as they pulled away. Stallone watched them go, his muscles aching but his heart still steady. He wasn't here to fight anyone. He was here for peace. But when you were a man who could handle himself, it was often the only language people understood. The dust settled in the aftermath of the brief but intense confrontation. Stallone's pulse remained steady as he wiped his hands on his jeans, taking a moment to watch the last of the bikers disappear down the road, their engines growling in retreat. The stillness of the canyon enveloped him once again, as if nothing had ever happened. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, and for a fleeting moment, Stallone felt the peace he had come for, uninterrupted at last. But the calm was short-lived. Just as he turned to head back toward the cabin, a low rumble of motorcycle engines echoed in the distance. It was the unmistakable sound of approaching riders, and this time it was louder. There was no doubt in his mind. The gang wasn't finished. They would be back, and it wasn't going to be a simple exchange of words this time. The first of the bikers came into view, tearing around a bend in the road with a cloud of dust swirling behind him. There were 4 of them now, far more than before, and each of them looked angrier, their eyes burning with the kind of resentment that came from being humiliated in front of their peers. Stallone's gaze shifted to the leader, who was now wearing an even more dangerous expression. His bruised ribs were evident as he moved stiffly, but his posture was still one of authority. He wasn't backing down. Behind him, his gang members had the same look of resolve on their faces, their clenched fists ready for another round. "You think you're tough?" the leader sneered as he pulled up to Stallone, dismounting his bike with a heavy thud. He took a step forward, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "You're nothing but a tourist, thinking you can play hero." Stallone didn't flinch. He stood tall, the dust settling around his boots, the wind brushing through his hair. He had fought plenty of men in his time, and this was no different. He wasn't here to prove anything. He was here to defend his space. If that meant going toe-to-toe with a gang of bikers, so be it. "Not a tourist," Stallone replied, his voice calm but firm. "Just a man looking for peace." You're the ones who came here to start trouble." The leader's expression shifted, from anger to something darker. Something that said he wasn't about to let Stallone get away with challenging him in front of his men. "You'll regret this," he growled, his hand drifting toward the knife tucked into his belt. The other bikers fanned out behind him, a circle of tension building as they positioned themselves around Stallone. Their eyes trained on him with a mixture of hatred and respect. They'd seen what he could do, and they didn't like it. They had come for a fight, and now they wanted it more than ever. One of the bikers, a younger man with a tattoo of a snake slithering across his neck, cracked his knuckles loudly, his gaze fixed on Stallone. "You're outnumbered this time," he taunted, taking a step forward. "Last time you got lucky. Won't happen again." Stallone didn't move. He didn't need to. His body was already prepared, his senses alert. He was waiting for the first move, watching the group carefully, measuring each of their stances. The fight would come to him, just as it always did. The leader's voice broke the tense silence. "Enough talk. Get him." The younger biker with the snake tattoo lunged first, his fist coming at Stallone's face with a wild swing. Stallone's reaction was swift, too fast for the biker to register. He ducked under the punch, his feet light on the ground. With a quick twist of his body, Stallone gripped the biker's wrist mid-swing, twisting it sharply. The biker let out a yelp of pain as Stallone's momentum sent him off balance. Without hesitation, Stallone swept his legs out from under him, sending the biker crashing to the dirt with a loud thud. The gang members hesitated for a brief moment, caught off guard by the speed and precision of Stallone's movements. The biker with the snake tattoo groaned, trying to push himself up, but his arm hung limply at his side. The fight was already going poorly for them, and it was only just beginning. The leader let out a furious roar, signaling his men to continue the attack. He charged forward, his knife now drawn, glinting menacingly in the fading light of day. Stallone watched the leader's every movement, his focus sharp. The leader was slower than he'd anticipated, likely still winded from their previous encounter, but his anger made him dangerous. Stallone didn't wait for the leader to get too close. He sidestepped the first wild swing, easily dodging the blade. The leader's arm followed through, leaving him exposed for just a moment. Stallone seized the opportunity. He grabbed the leader's wrist in midair, twisting the knife from his grip and sending it skittering across the dirt. In one fluid motion, Stallone delivered a swift punch to the leader's gut, knocking the air out of him. The leader staggered back, clutching his stomach, gasping for air. The bikers, now more reluctant than before, were beginning to realize just how outmatched they were. Stallone stood tall, his body relaxed but his mind alert. He had fought his way out of worse situations, but these men were learning the hard way that they had underestimated him. The remaining two bikers, both large and muscular, looked to each other, unsure of what to do next. They could see that Stallone wasn't afraid. He was in complete control of the situation. But pride and anger pushed them forward. They charged together side by side, hoping that their combined strength would be enough to overpower him. Stallone remained calm, his body moving like a well-oiled machine. The first biker came at him with a wild right hook, but Stallone ducked and countered with a lightning-fast uppercut to the man's jaw. The biker staggered back, momentarily dazed. Stallone followed up with a knee to the ribs, sending the man to the ground, gasping for breath. The second biker tried to take advantage of the opening, swinging a punch toward Stallone's face. But Stallone was already sidestepping, his body moving with a fluidity that left the punch missing by inches. He grabbed the biker's arm, twisting it behind his back with a force that made the man grunt in pain. In one smooth motion, Stallone took the biker down to the ground with a quick, controlled throw, leaving him sprawled out in the dust. The fight was over, and it had barely even begun. The leader, now winded and struggling to catch his breath, looked at his remaining men. His face was a mask of rage and disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were supposed to intimidate him, to force him out of the cabin. But now they were left with nothing but bruises and humiliation. Stallone took a deep breath, his heart still steady as he surveyed the scene. The bikers were defeated, scattered on the ground, groaning and clutching their wounds. The leader struggled to his feet, glaring at Stallone with hatred in his eyes. "Get up," Stallone said evenly, not looking at the fallen men. "Get out of here, and don't come back." For a long moment, the leader said nothing. Then, slowly, he raised his hand, signaling his gang to retreat. One by one, the remaining bikers stood, their pride shattered. They didn't say a word as they gathered their bikes and limped away. their engines sputtering to life as they disappeared down the road. Stallone watched them go, his body still coiled and alert, ready for anything. But the silence returned, just as quickly as it had been disturbed. The Grand Canyon stretched out before him once more. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Stallone could breathe again. The trouble was over. For now. The sun had nearly dipped below the horizon by the time the last of the bikers disappeared down the road, leaving only the sound of their retreating engines to echo through the vast canyon. Stallone stood in the midst of the clearing, his body still brimming with adrenaline from the fight. His muscles were sore, his hands were clenched into fists, but he wasn't about to let his guard down just yet. The leader and his men might have been humiliated, but Stallone knew that it wasn't over. He had fought enough battles to know that when a fight ended in a draw, it wasn't always the end. Sometimes it was only the beginning. He turned toward the cabin, feeling the last rays of the sun kiss his skin. The quiet was deafening, the kind of silence only the wilderness could provide. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax, letting the tension in his shoulders ease as he made his way toward the small wooden structure. The door creaked slightly as he opened it, stepping into the cool interior. He needed to clean up, get some rest, and prepare himself. There was a feeling deep in his gut, one that told him this wasn't over. Sure enough, just as he was about to close the door behind him, the unmistakable roar of motorcycles reached his ears. It was distant at first, but it was growing louder by the second. They were back. And this time, it wasn't just the handful of bikers from earlier. The sound of a dozen bikes filled the air, shaking the ground beneath his feet. Stallone's pulse quickened, and he closed the door with a soft click, locking it behind him. He wasn't about to wait for them to come barging in. The leader's pride had been wounded, and the rest of the gang were now likely to be out for blood. They had underestimated him once, but they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Stallone quickly checked the cabin's small window, peering out through the dusty panes. The gang was pulling up outside, their bikes lining the narrow dirt road in front of the cabin. The leader was there, looking angrier than before, and this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him was a much larger group. More bikers than Stallone had anticipated. The rest of the gang had rallied to their leader's side, likely hoping for revenge. Stallone didn't flinch. He had already been preparing for this moment. Without a word, he reached for his jacket, sliding it on with practiced ease. His mind focused, his body relaxed but alert, every muscle aware of what was coming. He wasn't going to let these men overrun him again. This was his territory now, and he wasn't going anywhere without a fight. He pushed the door open and stepped out onto the porch, the warm night air filling his lungs as he took in the scene. The gang had surrounded the cabin, the heavy rumble of their engines cutting through the stillness of the canyon. The leader was in the front, his face twisted in rage, the rest of the bikers forming a half-circle around Stallone. "You've had your fun," the leader growled, his eyes narrow slits of fury. "But this time, you're not walking away." Stallone stood tall, his arms relaxed at his sides, his stance steady. "I didn't want any of this. But if you think you're taking my cabin, you're mistaken." The leader cracked his knuckles, his grin predatory. "You're outnumbered, and you're going to regret not backing down the first time." Stallone's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "I've got no reason to back down now." The gang began to fan out, but Stallone wasn't intimidated. He had been in tighter spots before. The leader motioned to two of the larger bikers, signaling them to move in. They began to close the distance, their heavy boots thudding against the ground. With a sudden movement, the first biker lunged forward, swinging a crude-looking crowbar at Stallone's head. But Stallone was already in motion. He ducked low, rolling under the attack with fluid precision. The crowbar whooshed above him, narrowly missing. Without missing a beat, Stallone came up behind the man, grabbing his wrist and twisting it violently. The biker let out a sharp yelp as he dropped the crowbar, but before he could react, Stallone drove his knee into the man's gut with a force that sent him crumpling to the ground. The second biker, a tall, broad-shouldered man, swung a fist toward Stallone's face. It was a wide, unskilled punch, born from anger rather than technique. Stallone sidestepped with ease, grabbing the man's outstretched arm as he passed, and used the biker's own momentum to send him crashing into a nearby rock formation. The man groaned as he hit the ground, dazed and disoriented. The remaining bikers, now witnessing their companions fall one by one, were hesitating. They had come here expecting to bully Stallone into submission, not to face someone who could take them on with the ease and precision of a seasoned fighter. The leader, eyes burning with frustration, motioned for the rest of his gang to attack at once. And so they did. 3 of the remaining bikers charged, hoping to overwhelm Stallone by sheer numbers. The first biker went for a tackle, aiming to bring Stallone to the ground, but Stallone saw it coming from a mile away. With a quick sidestep, he caught the man's arm, twisting it and throwing him over his shoulder. The biker landed with a hard thud on the gravel, unable to get back up. The next 2 bikers didn't fare any better. One tried to deliver a solid punch to Stallone's ribs, but Stallone absorbed the blow with barely a shift in his stance. With a swift jab to the man's throat, he dropped him to his knees, gasping for air. Stallone followed up with a quick, bone-crushing knee to the chest, knocking the wind out of the biker and sending him sprawling to the ground. The final biker, a heavy-set man with a thick beard, rushed forward with a knife in his hand. The blade flashed in the dim light of the desert night, but Stallone was faster. With a sharp move, he sidestepped the attack, grabbing the biker's wrist and twisting it until the knife fell from his grasp. The biker's face twisted with pain, but Stallone didn't hesitate. He pushed the man off balance with a brutal shove, sending him tumbling backward onto the dirt. The leader, now alone and furious, pulled a small revolver from his waistband. "This is your last warning," he growled, his voice shaking with anger. "Get down on your knees and beg for mercy." Stallone's eyes locked onto the gun, then back up to the leader's face. "You don't get it, do you? I'm not leaving, and I'm not afraid of you." The leader's hand wavered for a moment, unsure, before he pointed the gun directly at Stallone. But before he could pull the trigger, Stallone was already in motion. In one fluid motion, he darted forward, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. The leader's hand swung out, but Stallone was quicker, ducking low and grabbing the leader's wrist in a firm grip. In one swift move, he twisted the man's arm behind his back, forcing him to drop the gun. The leader gasped in pain, but Stallone wasn't done. With a forceful push, Stallone sent the leader stumbling to the ground, his body sprawling onto the dirt. He wasn't going to finish him off. There was no need to, not yet, but the leader had no more fight left in him. Stallone stood over him, chest heaving with exertion, but his eyes were calm, his mind clear. "You're done," Stallone said, his voice cold and commanding. The leader groaned, still sprawled on the ground. He could only watch as his gang members, broken and battered, picked themselves up, nursing their wounds. Slowly, with no words exchanged, the remaining bikers began to retreat, their faces flushed with humiliation and rage. The leader, unable to rise, could do nothing but watch as his gang slunk away defeated. Stallone stood in the quiet aftermath, taking a deep breath. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he had made his point. The canyon was his, and no one was going to take it from him. With the last of the bikers disappearing into the distance, Stallone turned toward the cabin. His body ached, his muscles sore from the fight, but it didn't matter. He had earned his peace. For now, at least. The sun had long disappeared beneath the horizon, leaving behind only the faint light of a crescent moon casting shadows across the barren landscape. The sound of motorcycle engines had faded into the distance, but the tension in the air was still thick, like the smell of rain just before a storm. Stallone stood on the porch of the cabin, his chest still heaving from the exertion of the fight, but his mind was already shifting, thinking about what came next. This wasn't over. The bikers had been humiliated, but the leader's words echoed in his head. "You'll regret this." It was a promise, a challenge, and Stallone knew that men like this didn't easily forget. He scanned the road that stretched out in front of the cabin, his eyes searching the darkened horizon. The sounds of the desert night, crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of wind in the dry brush, were all too familiar. But something about the night felt different now. The stillness was charged, heavy with an anticipation that felt like the calm before a greater storm. The gang had learned that they couldn't push him around. But if Stallone had learned anything in his years of traveling and fighting, it was that those who failed to control a situation often found other ways to regain their power. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound. Something too soft to be the rumble of an engine, but enough to catch his attention. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the trees swaying gently in the wind. There was movement, figures moving across the darkened landscape. Not the gang, not yet, but something more. Something subtle. The air shifted as though it were charged with an unseen force. Instinctively, Stallone's body tightened in readiness, his mind sharpening as he adjusted his stance. He wasn't about to be caught off guard again. The figure emerged from the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, with a confident gait that betrayed neither haste nor fear. The soft glow of moonlight revealed his face, the leader of the gang. His clothes were torn, his face bruised from their previous fight, but his eyes, those were cold, full of malice and determination. He wasn't just here to make idle threats. Something was different about him now. This time there was a quiet, dangerous resolve in the way he carried himself. Stallone didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply watched as the leader approached, his steps slow but deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. Behind him, the rest of the gang stood in a loose formation, clearly biding their time, their eyes fixed on Stallone with a mix of anger, disbelief, and something else, fear. The leader stopped a few feet from Stallone, his gaze locking with the man's, the silence hanging between them like a living thing. Stallone could feel the change in the atmosphere. It was no longer a fight for a cabin. It was a power struggle, one where the stakes were far higher than either of them had anticipated. "You've made your point," the leader said, his voice rough, almost grudging. "But you don't know who you're dealing with." He paused, his hand resting on the handle of the large knife strapped to his belt. "You've won this round, but we don't forget. We don't lose without a fight." Stallone's gaze didn't waver. His expression remained calm, even as the tension mounted. He could feel the weight of the leader's words. This wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It was about respect, about dominance. The leader had a bruised ego, and it was clear he wasn't about to let Stallone walk away from this without some form of payback. "You didn't have to come back," Stallone said, his voice steady. "But you did. And that's your mistake." The leader's eyes flickered with rage, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he nodded, a subtle shift in his posture indicating that he understood exactly what Stallone was implying. His gang shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if they were waiting for a signal. They hadn't come here to back down. This time, they had come for retribution. "You're still outnumbered," the leader said, his hand still resting on his knife, his stance slightly more aggressive now. "You've got a few moves, but you're not going to fight all of us. You might have beaten us before, but you can't keep this up. We'll wear you down piece by piece." Stallone took a step forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he measured the leader's words. He had heard it all before. The threats, the intimidation tactics, the promises of an endless fight. But the leader was wrong. Stallone wasn't interested in wearing anyone down. He wasn't trying to make an impression or draw out some long, drawn-out battle. He was here to defend his space, to make it clear that no one was going to take anything from him. "You're still thinking like you've got the upper hand," Stallone said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "You came here because you thought I'd be easy to break. You thought you could scare me off, make me run. But what you don't understand is that I'm not the kind of man who backs down. I fight when I have to, and right now, I'm fighting for what's mine." The leader's jaw tightened, his expression hardening into something more dangerous than before. He looked to his men, silently gauging their reactions. The rest of the gang exchanged glances, the weight of the moment settling in. The leader may have been their figurehead, but he wasn't invincible. They were all well aware of the fact that their previous attack had been a failure, and now their pride was on the line. "I see you're not the same man I faced earlier," the leader said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "But this ends now." He stepped back, signaling his men to fan out behind him. There was a flicker of hesitation in their movements, a slight discord in the way they grouped together. Stallone could feel it, the shift in power, the change in their demeanor. They had come here thinking they could overwhelm him, but they were starting to realize that Stallone wasn't just a man they could push around. For a brief moment, the leader faltered. His pride had been bruised, and despite his anger, he could see that the balance of power was shifting. Stallone wasn't the one on the back foot anymore. He was the one with the advantage. And that made all the difference. The gang leader turned to his men, barking out orders, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. But Stallone was no longer watching them as a group. His eyes were locked on the leader, his focus sharp, unwavering. The fight was no longer a physical battle, it was a psychological one. The gang had been beaten before, and the leader knew that Stallone was ready to take them all down if he had to. "Get out of here," Stallone said again, his voice steady, almost cold. "You've lost. Go." The leader hesitated, a slight twitch in his jaw betraying his frustration. For a moment, the gang seemed to stall, unsure whether to fight or retreat. But in that moment of uncertainty, Stallone saw the shift. The leader was losing control, and without his leadership, the gang wasn't sure what to do next. They had come for blood, but they didn't want to risk their own in the process. The leader's face twisted into a snarl, but he knew he was beaten. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned on his heel and walked back toward his bike. One by one, the gang followed suit, their heads low, their pride shattered. Stallone didn't move, didn't speak, as they retreated into the darkness of the night. The silence settled over the canyon again, this time heavier than before. The power had shifted. Stallone hadn't just fought for his cabin. He had fought for his dignity, for control over his own space. The gang had come expecting an easy target, but they had learned the hard way that they had picked the wrong man. They wouldn't be back. Not now, and not ever again. Stallone stood on the porch, his muscles aching but his resolve unshaken. The night stretched out before him, silent, still, and his. For the first time since the gang had appeared, he allowed himself a brief smile. They had pushed him, they had tested him, but now they knew who was in charge. This was his place, and no one was going to take it from him. The morning after the bikers' retreat, the desert was still, almost eerily so. The air was dry and still, with the sun slowly making its ascent over the jagged canyon walls, casting long shadows across the dusty earth. Stallone had barely slept. The adrenaline from the night before still buzzed through his veins, and the tension of what was to come lingered in his muscles. He had won the battle, but there was something about the way the leader had retreated that didn't sit right with him. He knew they'd be back. It wasn't long before he was proven right. Just as he was about to take his first sip of coffee on the porch, the unmistakable roar of engines filled the morning air. The sound was louder this time, more confident, more deliberate. Stallone's gaze snapped to the road. He could see them in the distance, 3 motorcycles speeding toward him, the sun glinting off their chrome. The leader was in the front, the same cold malice in his eyes, and this time he was bringing reinforcements. His gang had clearly regrouped. There were no more hesitations, no more signs of doubt. These men had come for blood, and they weren't leaving until they had it. The moment Stallone had been expecting had arrived. As the bikers skidded to a halt in front of the cabin, the leader dismounted first. This time there was no mockery, no bravado. His face was grim, his jaw set in stone. He looked almost resigned. Stallone's fingers flexed, instinctively reaching for the knife tucked in his belt. He wasn't sure what this encounter would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. It was going to be a fight to the end. "You had your fun yesterday," the leader growled, his voice low and dangerous. "But I'm done playing games. We're finishing this now." Stallone studied the leader for a moment, reading the lines of tension in his face, the bitter resolve in his eyes. This wasn't just a matter of reclaiming the cabin anymore. The leader wasn't here to threaten. He was here for retribution. The night before, Stallone had knocked him down, humiliated him, and now he was back to make it right, or at least try. Stallone could see the spark of rage in the man's eyes. The pride of a leader had been hurt, and there was nothing more dangerous than a man backed into a corner, willing to risk everything to restore it. "I warned you yesterday," Stallone said, his voice even calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "But you came back anyway. That's your mistake." The leader's lip curled into a sneer, and with a sharp motion, he signaled for his men to surround Stallone. This time, there were no attempts at conversation, no empty threats. This was all-out war. The bikers moved swiftly, positioning themselves around him in a tight formation, each one eyeing him with a mix of anger and fear. The tension was thick, the air alive with the anticipation of the coming violence. "You think you're some kind of hero?" The leader spat, taking a step toward Stallone. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what you want? I don't care if you're the toughest guy in this godforsaken canyon. You're going to learn that you can't take down a gang like mine." Stallone took a deep breath, his eyes flicking over the men surrounding him. There were 6 of them now, including the leader. They had come prepared, and they weren't backing down. But Stallone wasn't intimidated. He knew how to handle men like this. They weren't going to scare him into running. And he certainly wasn't going to give up his cabin. "Not here to be a hero," Stallone replied, his voice calm but cutting through the leader's taunt. "I'm just here for peace. You came looking for a fight, and now you're going to get one." Without warning, the first biker lunged forward, his fist swinging in a broad arc, aiming for Stallone's head. The move was predictable, crude even, and Stallone easily sidestepped, letting the biker's punch fly past him. He didn't waste time. In one fluid motion, he spun on his heel, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. With a sharp twist, Stallone forced the biker to the ground, pinning him with a knee to the back. The biker gasped, struggling to breathe as Stallone applied more pressure. making it clear that this wasn't going to be a fair fight. The leader's eyes flared with fury, but before he could react, a second biker rushed in. This one, a massive man with a broad chest and an intimidating presence, charged with a ferocity that threatened to knock Stallone off his feet. But Stallone wasn't new to this. He ducked low as the biker swung a wild haymaker. The punch missed by inches, and Stallone countered with a swift kick to the man's knee, sending him crumpling to the ground in a howl of pain. The other bikers began to move in. Seeing that their comrades were going down too easily, their bravado quickly fading, one of them, a younger man with a scar running across his cheek, charged forward with a heavy crowbar in hand, thinking he could catch Stallone off guard. But Stallone was faster. He saw the man coming from a mile away. With a sharp, fluid step to the side, he caught the crowbar mid-swing, wrenching it from the biker's hands and using the weapon's momentum against him. A quick flick of Stallone's wrist sent the biker crashing to the ground, his head hitting the dirt with a sickening thud. The remaining bikers paused, realizing the same thing the others had already learned. Stallone was in control. The leader's fury boiled over, his eyes flashing with a dark promise. He drew a large knife from his belt, the blade gleaming in the moonlight. "Enough games," the leader snarled, his voice filled with venom. "It's time to end this." With a swift motion, the leader lunged at Stallone, the knife aimed directly at his chest. But Stallone had already anticipated the move. In the same breath that the leader struck, Stallone sidestepped, his foot catching the leader's leg and sweeping him off his feet. As the leader hit the ground with a grunt, Stallone wasted no time. He stepped forward, pinning the man's arms to the dirt with the weight of his body, taking control of the blade with a quick, practiced motion. For a moment the leader lay there, breathing heavily, his knife out of reach. He stared up at Stallone, his eyes wild with rage and disbelief. His gang, the ones who had followed him into this fight, now stood on the sidelines, unsure of what to do. It was clear now that the power had shifted. The leader struggled beneath Stallone, but the grip Stallone held on him was like iron. Stallone could feel the pulse of the man's anger, his desperation, but it was no use. The fight was over. The gang was broken, and the leader knew it. Stallone didn't need to say anything. He knew the leader understood what had just happened. He wasn't leaving this place. Not unless Stallone allowed it. "Get up," Stallone said, his voice steady, unyielding. "You've lost. Take your men and go. You don't belong here." The leader remained silent for a moment, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Slowly, with great reluctance, he pushed himself off the ground, glaring at Stallone with a look of pure hatred. But his pride was all that was left. The rest of the bikers, beaten and battered, began to turn their backs, their eyes filled with uncertainty and fear. The leader shot one final glare at Stallone before he backed away, motioning for his men to follow him. The bikers had come for a fight, for dominance. But now, they had no choice but to retreat, defeated in a way that was more final than they had ever expected. As the last of the bikers disappeared into the distance, Stallone stood alone in the clearing, his body aching from the battle. But there was no time for rest. Not yet. The fight for control, for dominance, was over for now. But he knew that peace could never be taken for granted. In a place like this, it was always just a brief pause before the next storm. Stallone watched the horizon, his muscles still coiled with the energy of the fight. The Grand Canyon stretched out before him, vast and empty, just the way he liked it. The bikers had learned their lesson, but Stallone had his own. This wasn't just a fight for territory. This was about more than that. It was about standing his ground, no matter the odds. And for now that was enough. The desert was quiet again, the stillness of the Grand Canyon stretching out for miles in every direction. The sounds of the bikers' engines had faded into the distance, leaving only the occasional whisper of the wind against the dry earth. Stallone stood in the middle of the clearing, his chest heaving with the effort of the fight, his body sore and bruised from the brutal confrontation. Despite the pain, there was a strange sense of satisfaction that came with the silence that followed the chaos. The battle was over. The bikers had retreated, their pride broken, and their mission thwarted. But Stallone didn't feel relief. He couldn't. He had been here before, on the edges of victory, but always aware that peace was fleeting. He knew the gang wasn't truly gone. They had retreated for now, but the leader's words still rang in his ears, and that sense of unresolved tension still gnawed at him. They had underestimated him, but it wasn't over. It wouldn't be until they had learned the full lesson. Stallone walked toward the cabin, his footsteps heavy on the gravel. His hand brushed against the rough wooden doorframe as he passed. his mind racing with thoughts of the fight. His body was covered in sweat, his muscles aching from the physical exertion. But there was something else too, a sense of alertness, a feeling that he wasn't yet safe. His instincts told him to stay on guard, to be ready for whatever might come next. Inside the cabin, he moved methodically. He grabbed a damp towel from the corner and wiped the sweat and dirt from his face. The cool cloth felt good against his skin, the roughness of the towel a small comfort after the chaos. He'd need to recover soon. There was no time to waste. The bikers were out there, regrouping, licking their wounds. Stallone had seen the anger and hatred in their eyes, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they had their revenge. He sank into a chair, resting his arms on his knees, his mind continuing to churn over the events of the past few days. He had been prepared for this, a lone man against a group of angry bikers. But he hadn't expected the viciousness, the unrelenting pursuit. They had come at him with everything they had, and he had fought back just as hard. The leader was no longer a threat, but the gang still had strength. They were dangerous, and they weren't going to let a defeat like this go unpunished. The faint sound of a distant engine broke his thoughts. It was too early for the bikers to be back. Still, Stallone stood up, moving toward the door to peek outside. He knew better than to get comfortable. The engine noise wasn't the rumble of motorcycles he'd heard before. It was quieter, softer, closer to a car than a bike. As he opened the door and stepped outside, he saw a figure moving toward him through the dust. It was a man, not one of the bikers, and his approach was slow but purposeful. Stallone's hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt, his body tensing as the figure drew closer. But the man didn't look like trouble. He didn't seem like one of the gang. His clothes were worn but not biker gear. His face was lined with age, his hair graying at the temples, and there was something in his demeanor that suggested he had seen much worse than what Stallone had just experienced. The man stopped a few paces away from the cabin, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Easy there," he said in a low voice, his accent thick but friendly. "I'm not here to fight." Stallone didn't lower the knife, but he didn't raise it either. He studied the man carefully, his gaze flicking from the stranger's face to his hands. The man's face was weathered, his eyes sharp and observant, but not threatening. Stallone's muscles relaxed, though he stayed alert, watching every movement. "What do you want?" Stallone asked, his voice steady but cautious. "I didn't invite anyone out here." The man smiled slightly, a wry smile, but it was tempered by something else, something understanding. "I figured you didn't," he replied, his tone not unkind. "Name's Carl. I live a few miles from here. I heard the engines last night. The bikers, they've been giving you trouble." Stallone's grip on the knife loosened just a fraction, his curiosity piqued. "They've been a problem," he said, his gaze narrowing slightly. "You saw them? You know who they are?" Carl nodded slowly, his eyes flicking toward the horizon. "I've seen them around before. That's the Steel Vultures. Bad news, those boys. They've been running this area for years, forcing people out of their homes, stealing what they want when they want it. They're not used to anyone standing up to them." Stallone didn't reply immediately. He looked over Carl's shoulder, scanning the horizon, but he didn't see anyone else. The tension in his shoulders hadn't completely eased. "They've been coming after me since I got here," he said, his voice quiet but laced with frustration. "First it was just words. Then it was threats. Now they've escalated. They won't stop until they get what they want." Carl's expression darkened. "They don't stop. Not until they've gotten what they came for, or until someone makes them. I've seen it happen too many times. They push and push, and if you don't fight back, they take everything." Stallone's thoughts flashed back to the leader's earlier threats. "You'll regret this," he had said. And now, with Carl's words ringing in his ears, Stallone knew that the battle wasn't over yet. It wasn't just a fight for the cabin. It was a fight for survival in a land where power didn't come from words, but from strength. Carl stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You can't keep going on like this alone. They'll come back, and next time, there won't be any mercy." Stallone didn't need to be told twice. He knew what Carl was saying. He couldn't keep this up forever, not by himself. He'd won the fight, but the gang would keep coming, pushing, testing him. The real challenge wasn't about taking them down. It was about how long he could keep it up. How long before they brought in reinforcements? How long before they grew tired of running and decided it was time to take him out, once and for all? Carl's eyes softened as he saw the realization dawn in Stallone's eyes. "You can't fight them all, no matter how tough you are," he said quietly. "You need allies. You need backup. These lands are full of people who are sick of the steel vultures. People who'd rather not live in fear anymore. They're scattered, isolated, but they're there. And they're ready to fight, if someone leads them. Stallone turned back to the cabin, his mind racing. The idea of gathering allies, of forming an alliance, wasn't something he had considered. He had been used to fighting alone, to standing on his own. But as the weight of Carl's words sank in, Stallone realized he couldn't afford to go at this alone anymore. "Tell me more," Stallone said, his voice steady but filled with a new resolve. Carl nodded, his eyes glimmering with something like hope. "There's a way. We just need to make the right connections. And I know who to talk to." The wind kicked up again, stirring the dust and the leaves. And for the first time in a long while, Stallone felt the stirring of something beyond just survival. This wasn't just about keeping the cabin. This wasn't just about fighting back against the steel vultures. It was about taking a stand for something bigger. It was about rallying the people who had been afraid for too long. The fight was only beginning, but now Stallone knew he didn't have to face it alone. "Let's get to work," he said, turning back to Carl, the weight of the coming battle settling on his shoulders, but with a renewed sense of purpose. The days that followed were a blur of constant movement. The quiet of the Grand Canyon, which had once offered Stallone such peace, now felt empty and unsettling. It was as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. His time alone in the cabin had already been interrupted once, but now, with the steel vultures and Carl's promise of allies swirling in his mind, Stallone knew that he couldn't just hide away. His fight had grown larger than just defending a cabin. It was about standing up for something bigger, about protecting not only himself but anyone who had been pushed to the edges by the likes of the bikers. Stallone spent hours strategizing, pacing back and forth inside the cabin as he gathered his thoughts. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, rattling the windows, but it didn't matter. His mind was elsewhere, focused, determined. Carl had given him a way forward, a path that led him out of isolation and into something bigger. He couldn't keep fighting alone. He needed to rally the people of the region, to forge alliances with the ones who had been living in fear for too long. But that wasn't going to be easy. The sun rose earlier than usual on the morning after Carl's visit, casting a pink glow over the canyon. The shadows of the rocks stretched out across the dusty land as Stallone packed his gear into the back of his Jeep. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about taking the fight to the steel vultures. He had to be ready to act, to lead, to make the change he wanted to see in this place. The idea of it, of fighting not just for himself but for everyone who had suffered under the bikers' rule, gave him a sense of purpose that was more powerful than anything he had ever felt. He had no clear idea of how long it would take to gather the right people. He didn't know who Carl had in mind as potential allies, or even if they would trust him. But Stallone wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. If there was one thing he had learned in all his years on the road, it was that you could always make things happen with the right kind of resolve. And Stallone had that in spades. The road ahead was as long as it was uncertain. But he wasn't about to sit around waiting for the next attack. He could feel the pull of the fight inside him. And now, with the promise of allies on the horizon, the need to act had become urgent. Carl had given him directions to a nearby town, a small settlement that had been largely untouched by the steel vultures, but still suffered under their shadow. The people there were cautious, wary of outsiders, but Carl had assured him that there were enough people who would be willing to stand up, to fight back. All Stallone needed to do was find them, earn their trust, and convince them that the time had come to take control of their own lives again. As he drove along the winding road, the landscape changed, the canyon giving way to open plains and scrub brush. The Jeep's tires kicked up dust as the sun began to climb higher in the sky. The vast expanse of the desert seemed to stretch on forever, but Stallone didn't feel the usual calm that came with the openness of the land. Instead, his mind was focused on the future, on the uncertainty of what was coming. He wasn't just trying to find allies, he was trying to ignite a fire that would spread, one that could turn the tide against the steel vultures once and for all. The town Carl had mentioned was a speck on the map, just a few scattered buildings and homes tucked away behind a thicket of brush and cactus. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Stallone pulled into the dusty town square, the wheels of his Jeep crunching over gravel as he slowed to a stop in front of a small, run-down diner. The air was thick with heat, and the scent of fried food wafted from the open windows. But it didn't feel like home. It felt like a place on the edge, on the brink of something that could either break or make it. Stallone took a deep breath and stepped out of the Jeep, the door creaking slightly as he moved. He stood for a moment looking around. The town felt abandoned, like no one had the energy to be out in the streets, much less confront the bikers who ruled over them. The quiet was unsettling, but Stallone knew he had to break it. The people here had to be ready for change. He had to be the one to spark it. As he walked into the diner, the bell above the door jingled, and the few heads that had been buried in newspapers or cups of coffee turned to look. It was a mixed crowd. Old men with tired eyes, young people with the same weariness in their posture. But there was a quiet tension in the air, a sense of expectation, as if they were all waiting for something, though none of them knew exactly what. Behind the counter, a woman with dark hair and a no-nonsense look met his eyes. She was young, maybe in her early 30s, but there was an edge to her gaze that suggested she had seen more than her fair share of trouble. Stallone approached the counter, his boots clicking against the floor, the soft murmur of conversation fading behind him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice a little guarded but not unfriendly. Stallone nodded, glancing around before speaking. "I'm looking for people who want to take back their town. The steel vultures, they've been terrorizing everyone here, haven't they?" The woman didn't blink, but something flickered in her eyes. A flicker of recognition, of understanding. She set down the coffee pot she had been holding and folded her arms across her chest. "Who wants to take on the steel vultures?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "You think you're the hero that's going to come save us all?" Stallone met her gaze steadily. "I don't want to save anyone. I'm just here to help you fight back. They're not going to stop until they have everything. You've got to make them." The woman studied him for a long moment, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the counter. She didn't seem impressed, but she didn't dismiss him either. Finally she nodded. "You're right. They won't stop," she said, her voice low, almost to herself. "But fighting back's not easy. We've been beaten down too many times. People are scared." She looked up at him then, her expression hardening. "But I'm listening. What do you want from us?" "I'm not asking for anything," Stallone replied. "I'm here to show you that you don't have to live like this. You don't have to let them win. If we work together, we can take them down." The woman's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of hope breaking through her stoic exterior. "Maybe we can," she said quietly. "But it won't be easy. It never is." Stallone leaned in, lowering his voice. "It won't be easy, but it's the only way." As the conversation continued, a few of the regulars in the diner began to listen in. One by one they began to nod, some cautiously, others with a more obvious eagerness. Stallone could see it in their eyes. The same wariness he had seen in Carl, the same frustration that had driven him to the edge of his own resolve. They were ready. It was just a matter of finding the right spark, and Stallone knew he was the one who could light it. As the last few bikers retreated, he had thought the fight was over, but he realized that was only the beginning. It wasn't just about surviving the steel vultures. It was about rising above them. And as he looked at the faces around him, the beginning of something much bigger started to take shape. The ride continued, only now it was a fight for freedom. And it was a fight he wasn't going to lose. The town of Dry Creek, tucked away in the outskirts of the canyon, had always been a place of isolation. The kind of place where people kept to themselves, where the quiet hum of daily life masked a deeper undercurrent of fear and resignation. It wasn't a place that drew attention, nor did it attract visitors, especially not the kind of people who would stir up trouble. But Stallone had arrived like a storm in the middle of that quiet, shaking things loose, bringing a hope that hadn't been there for years. The morning after his first conversation with the locals in the diner, something felt different. There was a buzz in the air, an electricity that ran through the streets of Dry Creek, something that hadn't been present the day before. The people here were used to quiet submission, accustomed to the looming presence of the steel vultures, and the sense that no matter what they did, they couldn't escape the shadow of fear that hung over them. But as the sun rose higher, bringing with it the heat of the desert, Stallone saw something new in their eyes. There was no grand speech, no rallying cry, but it was there. People were starting to believe. Carl had told him that change wouldn't happen overnight. That trust, like the land, was hard-won and slow to take root. But Stallone had already made inroads, speaking to the town's key figures. Those who had managed to survive and endure through the hardships. Those who had once raised their voices only to be met with intimidation. Now those voices were beginning to grow louder, softer at first, but strong enough to be heard above the sound of the wind that swept through the canyon. Stallone stood on the porch of the diner, his boots planted firmly in the dust of the town square. He had spent the morning meeting with a few of the locals, people who had come to him with questions, with hesitation in their eyes, but also with a spark of something else, curiosity. Some of them had been living in fear so long they weren't sure how to fight. Others, though, had that edge. The kind of edge that comes from years of oppression, years of being beaten down but never quite broken. Carl was right. The people of Dry Creek were ready. It wasn't just about standing up to the steel vultures anymore. It was about reclaiming their lives, their dignity. And Stallone knew it was time to act. They had to move quickly, before the bikers had a chance to regroup. The leader of the steel vultures wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat easily. And if Stallone knew anything about gangs like theirs, it was that they would come back with a vengeance, stronger and more dangerous. As the day wore on, more and more people came out of their homes, some cautiously, some with a palpable sense of purpose. The small square at the heart of Dry Creek, usually quiet and empty, began to fill with people. Some of them had heard rumors of what Stallone was planning. Others were simply curious, unsure of whether they were ready to face what would come next. But Stallone could see it in their eyes. They were starting to believe in something more than just survival. They were starting to believe in victory. By midday, Carl arrived with a group of people Stallone hadn't met before. Familiar faces from the outskirts of town. They were older, grizzled men and women who had lived through the worst of the biker gang's rule. They had seen the destruction, the violence, and the way the steel vultures tore through the land with impunity. But they had also seen how Stallone fought, how he had made it clear that he wasn't afraid. That was enough to inspire them to join the cause. Stallone met Carl's eyes as he approached with the new group. The older man didn't speak right away, but the determined look in his eyes told Stallone everything he needed to know. This was it, the turning point. This was the beginning of the real fight. "It's time," Carl said quietly, his voice low but firm. "These folks, they're with us now. We've got the strength we need. But we need to move fast. The vultures will be back sooner than you think." Stallone nodded, his mind already calculating the next steps. They had a limited window before the steel vultures regrouped, before their leader found out just how serious Stallone was. He couldn't afford to waste time. He needed to act fast, to strike while they had the advantage of surprise. "We won't have another chance," Stallone said, his voice filled with quiet authority. "We need to be ready." The group gathered, standing in a loose circle around Stallone and Carl. The locals, the ones who had once kept their heads down, now looked at each other with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. It was clear that many of them had never fought before. Not in the way Stallone had fought. They had endured, survived, but they hadn't taken the fight to the enemy. Not yet. Stallone's voice rang out, commanding attention. "This fight isn't just about defending our land. It's about showing them that they can't keep pushing us around. They think they can take what's ours, because they've done it for so long. But we're going to show them that they're wrong." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces were still unsure, but others were nodding, their fists clenched in quiet resolve. This was the moment when they could either accept their fate or take control of their future. Stallone's gaze swept over the group, locking eyes with each person, letting them see the quiet confidence in his eyes. "I'm not asking you to follow me because I'm some hero. I'm asking you to follow me because I'm ready to fight. And I know you are too. Together, we can take them down." It wasn't a grand speech. It didn't need to be. It was simple, direct, and it resonated with the people of Dry Creek in a way that words alone couldn't. They didn't need promises of glory, or some lofty vision of victory. They needed action. They needed to believe that they could take back their town, their lives, their freedom. A man near the front stepped forward, his face weathered but strong. He was a farmer. Stallone recognized him from one of the earlier conversations. His voice was rough but steady. "We've been living in fear for too long," the man said, his words carrying the weight of years of silence. "I've got a family to protect, and I won't let those bastards take it from me. I'm in." One by one, others began to speak, their voices rising in a chorus of quiet defiance. The group was coming together, their resolve solidifying with every passing moment. This wasn't just about fighting back. It was about reclaiming something that had been lost for too long. Stallone nodded, his gaze turning toward Carl. "We'll need to plan. We need to hit them hard, take them by surprise. But we can't do it alone. There are others out there, people who are waiting for someone to lead them. We need to find them." Carl nodded. "I know where to start. There are pockets of resistance out in the hills, scattered groups who've been running from the vultures. We'll find them, get them on our side." Stallone turned back to the group, his voice steady. We're not just defending ourselves anymore. We're going on the offense. We take the fight to them, and we show them what happens when you mess with the wrong people. With that, the plan was set into motion. The fight for Dry Creek had begun in earnest, and Stallone could feel the energy building. It was no longer just about survival. It was about making a stand. The ride was far from over. The journey had only just begun. As Stallone looked out over the group of people who had now joined him, he saw something in their eyes that had been absent before: hope. They weren't just victims anymore. They were fighters, and they were ready for whatever came next. And Stallone, for the first time in what felt like forever, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he wasn't fighting alone. It was a new day for Dry Creek, and this time it was their fight. The night before the final confrontation with the Steel Vultures, the town of Dry Creek was quieter than it had been in months. The once empty streets were filled with the bustling activity of people preparing for what was to come. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation, but also with something else: determination. The people of Dry Creek had been living in fear for too long, but now, with Stallone at their side, they had a purpose. They had a chance. The battle for their freedom was no longer just a distant hope. It was a living, breathing thing, and it was going to happen tomorrow. Stallone stood outside the small cabin that had once offered him solace, looking out over the canyon as the last light of day faded behind the jagged rocks. The wind kicked up dust around his boots, and he closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the quiet of the desert. For a moment, he allowed himself a brief sense of peace, a fleeting reprieve before the storm hit. The quiet had been hard to come by since the arrival of the bikers. The fight had begun with a single confrontation, a battle for a cabin that turned into a war for something bigger, something deeper. Now, it wasn't just about survival. It was about making a stand for everyone who had been afraid to fight back. The people of Dry Creek were no longer cowering in the shadows. They had found their strength, and they were ready to face the Steel Vultures head-on. But Stallone knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The leader of the Steel Vultures was ruthless, and had proven that he was willing to go to any lengths to assert his control. This would be the ultimate test, a test of strength, but also of strategy and resolve. Stallone wasn't naive enough to think the Steel Vultures would fall easily, but he had the element of surprise on his side. The people of Dry Creek, the scattered pockets of resistance, were ready to take the fight to them. And Stallone had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was their best chance. As the sky darkened, Carl approached, his footsteps soft against the dust. He had been with Stallone through the worst of it, a constant presence and a steady hand. The two men had formed an unspoken bond during the past few days, a partnership forged in the fires of shared struggle. Carl had become a crucial ally, someone who understood the landscape, the people, and the ways of the Steel Vultures. "How's the town?" Stallone asked, his voice low but carrying the weight of the moment. Carl paused for a beat, his eyes scanning the town square before meeting Stallone's gaze. "They're ready. They've been ready. I've seen fear in their eyes before, but this time it's different. They're not afraid anymore. Not the way they were." Stallone nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening. It was strange how quickly everything had changed. Just days ago, this town had been resigned to the Vultures' tyranny. Now, the people who had been shadows in their own town were standing tall, preparing for the first real fight they had known in years. Carl continued, "But we need to move fast. The Vultures are already regrouping. They'll come at us in force, bigger, stronger. We have to strike before they can solidify their position." Stallone turned back to the horizon, his thoughts drifting for a moment. The plan had been set. The ambush point had been chosen. An isolated stretch of road just outside town where the Steel Vultures convoy would have to pass through. They would strike hard and fast, using the element of surprise to weaken them before they even had a chance to react. Stallone had worked with Carl to organize the defense, people hiding in strategic spots, ready to ambush, ready to strike when the signal was given. "Tomorrow," Stallone said, his voice steady, almost to himself. "Tomorrow we take the fight to them." Carl gave a short nod. "We'll be ready. The town will be with us." The wind carried the distant sounds of the desert, a gentle reminder that they weren't alone. In the distance, the dry hills stood as silent witnesses to everything that had happened, and everything that was yet to come. Stallone felt the weight of what he had asked of these people. He had pushed them to their limits, asking them to believe in a victory they hadn't tasted in years. He had led them to this point, but tomorrow they would lead themselves. Tomorrow they would fight not for Stallone, but for their own future. That night, the small town of Dry Creek was alive with the hum of quiet preparation. The streets were lit by lanterns, casting long shadows across the dusty road. People moved in and out of the makeshift command center, a small building at the edge of town where Carl and the others had been gathering intelligence. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, of oil, and of determination. Everyone was working, and Stallone moved among them, offering quiet words of encouragement, giving final instructions, making sure everyone knew their role. It was a well-organized operation, one that had taken shape over the past few days. They weren't just a ragtag group of survivors anymore. They were a force. As night fell, Stallone stood near the town's edge, looking out at the distant horizon. He could almost hear the rumble of the steel vultures' bikes in the distance, the promise of chaos, the final showdown that would decide everything. It wasn't just about survival. It was about standing up, about showing the world that there was strength in the face of fear. That was what this fight was about, the reclaiming of their land, their freedom. The soft sound of footsteps behind him made Stallone turn, and he saw Carl coming toward him, a silent companion in the night. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need to. The quiet between them said everything. They both understood what this fight meant. Carl finally broke the silence. I never thought we'd make it this far. But now, he trailed off, the words unspoken but understood. Stallone gave him a look, his face shadowed but resolute. Now we finish it. For them. For everyone who's been silenced. Carl nodded slowly, his gaze distant. It's going to be a long road ahead, win or lose. Stallone's expression hardened. We're not losing. Not this time. The words hung in the air, a declaration of intent, a promise that they would fight until the end. And no matter what came next, Stallone knew one thing. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was everyone's fight. Tomorrow they would stand together, not just as victims of the steel vultures, but as a united force. The night stretched on, the stars above them an endless reminder that they weren't alone. The road ahead was long, filled with danger and uncertainty. But in that moment, Stallone knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking it alone. Tomorrow they would strike. Tomorrow the fight would be decided. And no matter the outcome, Stallone had already won.